I continue to be struck by the reality of using the how Americans view the attempted assassination of President Trump of just about a year ago. It seems longer because so much has happened. I view that as an incredible prism to try to understand how the red and blue America view Donald Trump and view his role in our lives. Okay. What an extraordinary thing for not just a former president out on the campaign trail on the eve of his convention. What an extraordinary thing for someone to attempt to assassinate that person. But he wasn't just a former president. Again, he was the front runner for the presidency. And he is the dominant figure in our culture. I hear regularly from even people who do not like Donald Trump the reality. No one in our lifetime has dominated America and really the world the way Donald Trump does, politically, culturally, symbolically, and in terms of emotion. And to have that person nearly killed, and of course, that day, other people were grievously wounded. One, Corey Ator, lost his life. But Donald Trump almost lost his life. And the thing that I want to emphasize to you, with nearly a year to reflect upon this, and visible to close observers in real time, was that the left, the people who do not like Donald Trump, who disagree with him on policy, who wish he weren't president, they did not treat his attempted assassination the way they would have had that been Barack Obama or Joe Biden or Kamala Harris or Bill Clinton. They really tried to dismiss it. And the reasons for that are quite something. And they're quite, it's one of the best ways to understand what we're going through still as a country, as people adjust to being either in the category of glad Donald Trump's president or very unhappy about it. This, to some extent, it's understandable in the way our news cycle works, why people moved on in some cases so quickly from Donald Trump's assassination. It happened on the eve of his convention and all the things that brought, including a few days later, his selection of his running mate, J.D. Vance. And of course, shortly after that, Joe Biden got out of the race. It's 8 days after Donald Trump was shot in Pennsylvania. Joe Biden dropped out. And that obviously was a big news story too. But how remarkable that a former president, the front runner for the nomination, is shot and almost killed. And both at the time and to this day, the motive of the killer, Thomas Crooks, you may not even recognize his name because he's been so little scrutinized. The motives of Thomas Crooks are still unknown. Can you imagine that? Someone tries to kill the president, former president, front runner, and between the government and the media, it is an absolute mystery. I've read nearly everything I can get my hands on to try to understand why the guy tried to kill Donald Trump. It's an absolute mystery. What an incredible story. And what is not a mystery, though, is how seminal this moment was and still is for, I think, two reasons. First, I think people who don't understand the support Donald Trump has don't recognize the degree to which MAGA rallied around Donald Trump, and many others did as well, not just MAGA. Of course, the most famous convert based on the heroism and grit that Donald Trump showed that day in Butler was Elon Musk, who went from basically being kind of leaning Democrat, sort of vaguely supportive of Donald Trump sometimes, to being a full-on supporter. And so many people, and I heard this in Milwaukee at the convention, and I've heard it every day since practically, that Donald Trump himself believes that it was divine intervention that saved him that day. And that the people who support Donald Trump and saw his grit and heroism and determination that day, many of them also say, well, there's something had to be going on there. That he chose to turn in a way he normally wouldn't, that he brought up this chart, this famous immigration chart, which he normally did not bring up at that part of his presentation, and that he turned to it. This was all extraordinary. And the hummingbird wings thing. I mean, somehow he lived that day. And so one thing to understand, if you don't feel it yourself, you should know that tens of millions of Americans feel that this was a rallying moment, for many a divine inspiration, for many a determination that Donald Trump was the right person to be president, even if they've been wavering before, like Elon Musk. Extraordinary in that respect. Also not a mystery, and it's something that's far less uplifting, is what that moment said then and says now about our individuals and institutions that have for a decade been hostile to Donald Trump and to the movement he leads. Okay. If you see that group, that second group through the prism of the shooting, the way this was covered both at the time and to this day, It's a story about corporate media and their hostility to Donald Trump and their loss of credibility in the eyes of people, again, including people who weren't supporters of Donald Trump. But it's a story also about the institutions we talk about here so often, the liberally leaning institutions in media, corporate America, universities and colleges, nonprofits, all of these places that have always opposed Donald Trump, oppose him now, and who have lost credibility in part, not because everyone in Red America expects 100% support for Donald Trump, because they don't seem to appreciate what Donald Trump means to those who do support him. It's an extraordinary thing. And this failure to cover Butler in real time and going forward as they would have and should have had it been a Democrat, that's not just some sort of minor misstep. It wasn't a short-term failure of judgment or getting the tone wrong on live TV. It really is about a feeling about MAGA and about why so many Americans turned to Donald Trump in 2016 and then in 2024 because they didn't like the direction of the country. Okay? Just as we saw with the Biden acuity issue, just as we saw with the Russiagate investigation. You don't see retractions, you don't see accountability, you don't see self-reflection. What you see is a press corps representing the liberal establishment of the country, which just overwhelmingly knew they had to cover this event. But in the immediately afterwards, the immediate aftermath of the attempted assassination, already turning to say, without knowing the motive of the killer, which we still don't know, that this was Donald Trump's fault. I could show you a lot of examples for it, laying some of the blame, at least, on the president himself for being shot, something that I don't think you would have seen had Barack Obama been shot. Here is, for instance, Martha Raddatz, my former colleague at ABC News, talking the immediate aftermath of the attempted assassination about where she thought the accountability was to be found.
President Trump and his supporters have contributed to this violent rhetoric as well.
Well, absolutely, George. We were just looking back this morning at some of the things that former President Trump has said. He warned last March of potential death and destruction if he were charged by the Manhattan District Attorney. Our country is being destroyed as they tell us to be peaceful. Trump in January warned of bedlam in the country if the criminal charges against him succeeded. And of course, in March, he said, now, if I don't get elected, it's going to be a bloodbath for the whole. That's going to be the least of it. It's going to be a bloodbath for the country. That will be the least of it. He said he was partly joking and that was taken out of context. But those are indeed his words.
Now, of course, that bloodbath thing was about the auto industry and is something that's on the greatest hits of the press, just willfully, it would appear, making misleading characterizations of what Donald Trump said. But leaving that aside, there's no doubt Donald Trump has said a lot of things that have divided the country. There's no doubt that he's partly responsible for, and some would say greatly responsible for, the tone that's existed in American politics. But the mentality in the immediate aftermath of the near murder of the former president and leading presidential candidate to turn to fly-specking his statements rather than the many, many statements of Democrats hostile to Donald Trump is quite something. Here's Margaret Brennan, who also, like Martha Raddatz, hosts a Sunday show on one of the major broadcast networks. Margaret Brennan of CBS, right along the same lines.
Taking it right to where Democrats are trying to prevent it from going. Those words have extreme weight. But if just to separate topic, very much related, the language around this campaign has been about us versus the system, me versus them, that all the legal cases against Donald Trump he claims are politically motivated to prevent him from re-election. By alleging that there is a connection to this attempt on his life, it would escalate that.
I mean, again, I'm all for the press scrutinizing things, and I'm all for the press scrutinizing Donald Trump. But you see in the immediate aftermath of the near death of Donald Trump, people wanting to hold him accountable for his own near murder. It's kind of incredible. And I'll say again, you don't know the motive. After we see any shooting, whether it's an extraordinary moment like this or a mass shooting, people always want to jump to conclusions about the motive of the killer, the alleged killer. I remember after the Oklahoma City bombing, not a shooting, but a bombing, mass speculation in the media that it was some sort of terrorist act by a foreign terrorist, perhaps an Islamic terrorist. And of course, it turned out to be homegrown Timothy McVeigh, who was convicted for the crime. You can't jump to conclusions. In this case, in the absence of any sense of why the shooter did what he did, again, which sustains to this day, to jump to the conclusion that what contributed to the shooting was Donald Trump's own words. A lot of Americans look at that and say, this is why the press has lost so much credibility, why their credibility has plummeted so far. So we went into the convention, and the media covered his speech and everything else almost entirely separate from the fact that he was shot, except to make fun of the fact that he was wearing a bandage on his ear, and to engage in a lot of speculation about whether or not he actually was shot. Okay. Now, again, I'm all for scrutiny. There were things about that day that were a little odd. I acknowledge being confused by the reaction of the crowd to the shooting. It didn't seem organic to me. But here is Michael Steele, former Republican National Committee chairman, and someone who long before this had turned against his party and Donald Trump. Here he is on MSNBC speculating about whether Donald Trump was in fact actually shot.
Let's start with last night in the Band-Aid. That's fine. Where I am at this point is it's been 3 days going on 4 since this horrific event occurred. A person lost their life, 2 have been severely injured, and yet we've not received a medical report from the hospital, nor have we received a medical report from the campaign or from the Trump organization about the extent of the damage to his ear. If he was shot by a high caliber bullet, there should probably be very little ear there. And so we'd like to know that. Is there cosmetic surgery involved? What is the prognosis for recovery? Were there stitches? What is the extent and nature of the damage to his ear? Was it caused by a bullet, as opposed to, as some reports from those on the scene, other reporters, saying that it was actually shards of glass from the teleprompter itself, not the bullet? So there are a lot of questions around that ear.
There are a lot of questions around that ear. You know, there's conspiracy theorists on the right and conspiracy theories on the left. And you're not going to stamp them out. But I say again, this was like a week after he'd been shot, and the doctors had spoken out and explained what had happened, and the forensics were done, and the weapon was found that shot him. And yet you heard all this skepticism from the left.